The ring arrived on the writing desk again on the fourth morning, placed there with the same deliberate precision as the 3 mornings before it, catching the pale October light that came through the east-facing window of Eleanor's small sitting room. She stood looking at it for a long moment before she turned away and went downstairs to see about the fires. That is where the story ends, and also where it begins. Eleanor Voss, in a house that was not quite her own and not quite anyone else's anymore, moving through rooms that had belonged to her father before the cards took them, waiting for a life that someone else had selected for her to arrive and settle around her shoulders, like a coat cut for a different woman. Ashford Hall was not an unkind house. It had stood on the Hertfordshire border for 3 generations of Vosses, long enough for the stonework to grow familiar and the gardens to lose their formal severity, the boxwood hedges spreading a little beyond their original stations, the gravel walks soft with fallen leaves each autumn as they were now, in October of 1832. The estate was modest by the standards of its county neighbours, some 400 acres of farmland and parkland, and a walled kitchen garden that Eleanor had managed herself since her father's health had begun to fail 2 years prior. She knew every corner of it. She knew which gateposts were loose, and which upper windows let in the northeast wind, and which a section of the south wall needed repointing before winter. She knew all of this because no one else had bothered to know it, and the knowing had passed to her the way most practical responsibilities in that house had done, quietly, without ceremony, as if by a process of natural redistribution. Her mother, Lady Voss, knew none of this. Lady Voss had always occupied herself with the drawing room rather than the grounds, with morning calls and calling cards and the careful management of social standing. And in the years since her husband's debts had become impossible to conceal, she had redirected those considerable organizational energies toward a single project: Eleanor's marriage to a man sufficiently solvent to absorb the family's liability. She was not cruel in the way of women who enjoy cruelty. She was efficient in the way of women who have long since converted their daughters into line items in a household account. Sir Edmund Hartley had been identified that past summer, approached through an intermediary, and found to be willing. He was a baronet of 51 years, a widower with grown children from his first marriage, possessed of a shooting estate in Lincolnshire and a townhouse in Upper Brook Street, and approximately 12,000 a year. He was also cold in the specific way of men who have spent their lives measuring what things are worth. He had looked at Eleanor the first time they were introduced, at the Carltons' dinner in September, the way he might have examined a piece of furniture he was considering acquiring, noting the condition of the legs, the soundness of the joints, the estimated cost of any needed restoration against the value of the piece. Eleanor had smiled at him across the table with the level, unrevealing expression she had cultivated over years of performing a grace she was not always given grace in return, and she had said precisely nothing of consequence, and he had found her satisfactory. Lady Voss found him excellent. The arrangement had moved forward through October with the speed of a transaction that both principal parties wished to conclude. The debt figure had been approximately £800, most of it accumulated by Eleanor's late father across a decade of cards and hopeful speculation that had never quite paid out. Hartley had offered £1,000 against it, which was more than sufficient, and which Lady Voss had accepted before the last of the Michaelmas rents were even collected. Eleanor had not been consulted. This was not unusual. What was unusual was the ring, which Hartley had produced at a drawing-room visit in the second week of October, a sapphire in an old-fashioned gilt setting, presented to Eleanor with the manner of a man transferring title to a property he had already decided to purchase. She had held it in her palm for the space of 3 breaths, feeling its weight and its coldness, and then she had closed her fingers around it and kept it through the remainder of the visit, because there had been no other choice available in that room at that moment. She returned it to her mother that evening. She set it on the little writing desk in her mother's dressing room while Lady Voss was occupied with her maid, placed it without ceremony on the correspondence blotter, and said, "I cannot accept his suit, Mamma." She said it in the same steady voice she used when she found an error in the household accounts or a problem with the Westfield drainage, as a plain fact requiring acknowledgement, and she left the room before her mother could recover her script. She knew there would be consequences. She had calculated them. The debt would remain. Social pressure would intensify. Her mother would find other instruments. Eleanor had not refused out of ignorance of these things. She had refused because there was a point past which calculation could no longer justify what was being asked of her. And Hartley's cold eyes measuring her across the drawing room had been that point. The ring reappeared on Eleanor's writing desk the following morning. She set it aside on the windowsill. Her mother said nothing at breakfast. The ring reappeared the next morning on the desk, where it had been before. Eleanor placed it in the drawer of her work table. The morning after that, it was back on the desk, retrieved from the drawer and repositioned with deliberate patience, as if Lady Voss were conducting a quiet argument by means of a single, repeated object. On the fourth morning, Eleanor stood looking at it in the pale October light and understood that this small daily ritual was going to continue until she surrendered to it or until something else intervened. It was 3 days after the ring first appeared on her desk that she met him. She had been in the walled kitchen garden just past noon, examining a section of the drainage culvert that Mrs. Crane had reported was becoming obstructed when the rain came. It arrived the way October rain arrives in Hertfordshire, without much warning and with every intention of staying, a cold, insistent rain that had the garden path puddled within 10 minutes and the stone wall steaming. Eleanor had been wearing her old grey wool walking dress, the serviceable one she kept for estate work, and she pulled her shawl tighter and began making her way back along the garden path toward the house. The man was standing at the garden gate. He was a tall man, considerably taller than she had registered at first, standing at the gap in the south garden wall where the wooden gate hung open on its iron hinges. He was wearing a dark coat, practical rather than fashionable, and carrying a leather satchel that had the look of something used regularly rather than kept for appearances. He was also entirely wet. The rain had been at him for some time, and he had not moved to shelter, and he was writing in a small notebook with the focused application of a man who either did not notice the weather or had decided to regard it as beneath his notice. Eleanor might have passed him as the path to the kitchen door lay in the other direction. She did not pass him. "There is a dry shed at the end of the south walk," she said. "If you are surveying the wall, it will still be standing when the rain stops." He looked up from the notebook. He had a composed face, neither young nor old, with steady grey eyes that registered her with a completeness that she found, in the first moment, slightly disconcerting. Not the measuring look of a man calculating worth. Something more patient than that. Something attentive. "Thank you," he said. The words were quiet and precisely placed. "I am Mr. Dawson. I have been commissioned to survey the estate on behalf of its prospective creditors." "I know," Eleanor said. Her mother had mentioned a steward would be attending to the property assessment. She had not thought much of it. She gestured toward the shed. "Come out of the rain, Mr. Dawson, or your notebook will be unreadable before you finish the wall." A corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile. He followed her to the shed. She found him a piece of old sacking to cover the satchel and left him with the observation that the south wall's measurements would be approximately 12 feet at the east end and rather less at the west, as the original construction had been slightly irregular, which she had always suspected might cause someone conducting a formal survey to make an error. She said this helpfully, not archly, because it was true and because it seemed useful, and she went back to the house through the rain without waiting to see whether he thanked her again. He was at the estate for a week, surveying the grounds and the farmland and making careful notes in his small leather-covered notebook. Eleanor encountered him in the way one inevitably encounters anyone working across a property of 400 acres that one also regularly walks, not by arrangement, but through the natural geometry of the place. She passed him at the stable yard on Thursday, carrying a list of farrier's costs she was bringing to Mrs. Crane. She found him in the East Meadow on Saturday morning, where she went every Saturday to walk the boundary fence and assess what needed attention before winter. He was precise in his observations and economical in his speech, and he asked her twice about specific features of the property, both times because she clearly knew the answer, and he evidently preferred accuracy to assumption. On the fourth day, she found him in the estate library. She had gone there at 3:30 in the afternoon, as she often did, because the library was the one room in the house where she could be fairly certain of not being required to perform anything. It held a modest but well-maintained collection, accumulated across 3 generations, and Eleanor had read a large portion of it. She went in and found him standing at the far wall with an open folio on the reading stand, examining what appeared to be the original property map of the Ashford grounds, a large format document drawn in 1798 with the farmland boundaries marked in red ink. He did not appear startled to find her there. She did not appear startled to find him. They had, without discussing it, both arrived at a sufficiently accurate model of the other's daily patterns to make accidental encounters feel less accidental than they were. "The eastern boundary has shifted since this was drawn," Eleanor said, looking at the map. "My father had that section of the fence moved after the flooding in 1824. The new line is about 30 yards west of what you see there." David Dawson set down the notebook he had been using as a reference. "That would explain the discrepancy I noted yesterday." "It would. There should be a notation in the estate records if you need the precise measurement. Mrs. Crane keeps the estate ledgers in the butler's pantry." "She mentioned that." He paused. "There was a small fire in the library grate, which Mrs. Crane kept lit in October regardless of who was using the room, and the light from it was warmer than the grey afternoon coming through the windows." "You manage a great deal of this estate yourself." It was not precisely a question. Eleanor set her book down on the nearest table. "Someone must." He looked at her with that careful attentiveness again, the kind that did not calculate and did not perform. She found it, in the particular warmth of that room on that grey afternoon, more unsettling than anything Hartley had produced with his cold measurement, because this attention did not want anything from her that she was unwilling to give. And she was not accustomed to that variety of regard. She stayed in the library for an hour. They talked about the estate records and then about the flooding of 1824. And then, by gradations she could not have mapped precisely, about the relative merits of farming clay-heavy soil against lighter chalkland, which was a subject she had strong views on from 7 years of observing the South Fields. He listened without interruption, which was also not something she was accustomed to. When she finally rose to leave, he said, "The map is incorrect in at least 3 other particulars, if you are willing to be consulted again." He said it without presumption, as a simple matter of practical logic. Eleanor said she supposed she could spare an afternoon. She said it with her usual level voice, and went home. She did not look back from the library doorway because she was not certain what she would see on his face if she did, and she was not yet sure whether certainty was something she wanted. Lady Voss's campaign proceeded through the same week on a separate track. The ring appeared, and was removed each morning. Hartley called on Wednesday, and Eleanor sat through 40 minutes of him talking about his Lincolnshire estate, his opinions on the management of tenanted land, and his view that the annual autumn ball at the county seat was an event sufficiently significant to warrant travelling down from town. Eleanor gave him tea and said nothing she would regret, and watched the light fade outside the drawing-room windows, and counted the minutes with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has learned to survive drawing rooms through arithmetic. Afterward, her mother said, in the corridor, with the particular brightness of a woman who had made a decision and required it to be ratified, "He has spoken to me about a November ceremony, Eleanor. The parish church would do very well, I think. Nothing elaborate is required." Eleanor said, "I see." Her mother took this for progress. It was not. The ring appeared on the 5th morning on the writing desk as before, and Eleanor left it there. She went downstairs and found Mrs. Crane in the corridor near the library, the older woman carrying a tray of correspondence with the unhurried competence that she brought to everything. And Eleanor stopped to speak with her about the kitchen garden drainage, which still needed attention. Mrs. Crane was 63 years old and had been housekeeper at Ashford since before Eleanor was born, and she knew the house and its inhabitants with the thorough, unsentimental clarity of a woman who has seen most things and been asked to have opinions about very few of them. She listened to Eleanor's description of the drainage problem, offered 3 practical suggestions, and then looked at Eleanor with the direct quiet of someone who notices more than they are asked to notice. "Mr. Dawson has the East ledgers from me this morning," she said. "He will be in the library until noon, I expect." Eleanor thanked her and went to oversee the laying of the fires in the upstairs rooms. And if her path to the upstairs rooms required passing the library door, that was a matter of the house's geography and not of any intention she was prepared to name. She heard them as she passed the library 2 days later in the afternoon. The door was not fully shut because the library door at Ashford had always hung slightly open unless someone made a deliberate effort to close it, a property of the old iron latch that had never been corrected, and Eleanor was moving through the corridor at the particular quiet pace she adopted when she had no specific destination, the way she walked when she was thinking. She was not attempting to listen. She was simply passing, and the voices carried through the narrow gap in the door, as voices always carry in old stone corridors where the walls hold sound rather than absorbing it. Her mother's voice first, very clear. "She is being theatrical, Sir Edmund. It is nothing more than that. A young woman who has had too much latitude in the management of this house and who requires a firmer hand than her father ever provided." Then Hartley's voice, lower and unhurried. "I have found that a clear understanding of the financial situation generally produces compliance." Precisely so. Her mother's voice had the particular warmth of someone confirming a diagnosis they have already made. Eleanor is an intelligent girl. She understands the situation. The resistance is performance, and performance requires an audience. Once she recognizes that no one of consequence is watching, she will come to reason. A pause, the sound of the fire. Eleanor stood absolutely still in the corridor, her hand not quite touching the wall. "The November date still suits me," Hartley said. "Then we shall proceed as planned." Eleanor walked the rest of the corridor to the stairs and went up them steadily, one hand on the smooth wood of the banister, and she sat in her small sitting room for 20 minutes, looking out at the October garden, without seeing it. The drainage culvert needed attention. The east fence needed survey. The ring was on her writing desk. Her mother had just described her to the man she was expected to marry as a managed inconvenience whose objections would dissolve under sufficiently applied financial reality. She had not collapsed. She had endured, She had continued to function with quiet sufficiency through every morning call, every arranged encounter, every daily appearance of the ring on her desk, because she had understood that the alternative was some kind of rupture that would cost the household something it could not afford. She had, in short, been exactly what her mother described. She had been performing a patience she no longer entirely felt. And her mother had looked directly at that performance and named it as such, not to Eleanor, but to the man who was proposing to purchase Eleanor's compliance along with the rest of the estate's liabilities. The obligation to perform dissolved in that corridor. Not dramatically, the way ice gives way when water has been working at it long enough. She was no longer performing patience. She was simply herself, and what she was someone who would not be sold, and who would say so plainly in whatever room was available. She went to the library the following afternoon. David was already there when she arrived, standing at the reading stand with the property map again and the notebook open beside it. He looked up when she came in, and something in her face must have been different from the previous afternoons, because he did not go back to the map. "You are quite still today," he said. "I have decided something." She moved to the chair near the fire and sat down, not with the careful, controlled posture of the drawing room, but with the plain occupancy of a person using a chair for its purpose. "I am going to refuse him publicly. At the morning call Lady Carlton has proposed for next Tuesday, there will be half the county present." She said this the way she might have said the east fence needs repair, as a practical statement of fact. He was quiet for a moment. The fire settled in the grate. "That will cost you something," he said. "It will cost me less than the alternative." He looked at her for a moment with that careful grey attention. He said nothing more about it. He came and sat in the second chair, the worn one that had been his since the second afternoon, and he picked up his notebook, and they remained in the library together for 2 hours, while the October light dropped in the windows and the fire burned lower, and she read and he worked, and neither of them required the room to be anything other than what it was. Near the end of the second hour, when the room had gone quieter than it had been, and the fire was a low, steady thing between them, he said, without looking up from the notebook, "I find I cannot pretend that what happens on Tuesday is a matter of professional indifference to me." Eleanor was quiet for the space of several seconds. Outside, leaves moved against the window glass. "Nor I," she said. Neither of them elaborated. The warmth of the fire and the particular quality of the silence between them were sufficient elaboration. She rose to leave at 4:30, and at the threshold she paused with her hand on the doorframe, the worn paint smooth under her palm, and she did not look back, and she was aware of him not looking away. The morning call on the 14th of October brought 10 visitors to Ashford's drawing room, which was as many as the room could accommodate, without appearing strained. Lady Carlton was there with her 2 daughters. Mrs. Finch came, whose husband sat on the county bench. Old Colonel Hadley arrived, as he did at most morning calls within riding distance, for the company rather than the cards. There were others, filling the wingback chairs and the striped settee and the little gilt chairs that had been brought from the dining room for the occasion, and Lady Voss presided over the arrangement of tea and conversation with the efficient warmth of a woman who was accustomed to managing a room, and who had, this particular morning, an agenda. Hartley was present. He had arrived at 10 in his own carriage, which was a well-appointed vehicle in dark green with a coachman in matching livery. And he occupied the chair nearest Lady Voss with the settled possession of a man who had already signed the papers. The tea was served. The weather was discussed. Lady Carlton spoke about her eldest daughter's admirer in Kent and whether the attachment was likely to proceed, and Mrs. Finch offered an opinion on the matter. Eleanor sat in her usual chair near the east window, straight-backed, with her teacup, and she watched the room with the quiet attention she had always brought to rooms that were waiting for something. Lady Voss waited until there was a natural pause in the conversation, which arrived at about 20 minutes past 11. Then she said, with the practiced ease of a woman producing a prepared announcement as though it had occurred to her spontaneously, "I am so pleased to be able to tell you all that Eleanor is to be married. Sir Edmund has been most particular, and we have settled on the parish church in November. Banns to be read beginning next Sunday." There was the small rustle of pleased surprise that such announcements produce in drawing rooms. Lady Carlton said, "How delightful." Mrs. Finch turned toward Eleanor with a smile ready. Eleanor set her teacup down on the side table. "I am afraid my mother is mistaken," she said. The room changed. The particular quality of warmth and pleasant expectation that had been present compressed suddenly into something different, still and alert. Lady Voss's smile did not fall immediately. It recalibrated. "Eleanor," she said with a careful brightness. "I am not to be married to Sir Edmund," Eleanor said. "I have made this clear to my mother, and I make it clear now. His suit does not have my consent, and it will not have it. I am sorry if there has been any confusion about this." She said it in her level, unornamented voice, the voice she used for practical facts, and she looked at Hartley directly as she said it, because that seemed the honest thing to do, and she watched him take the refusal with the expression of a man recalculating an estimate. The room required a moment to resolve itself. In that moment, the drawing-room door, which was not quite fully closed, opened further, and Mrs. Crane appeared in the doorway with a visitor. He was a young man, neatly dressed, carrying a leather dispatch case of the kind used by secretaries and solicitors, and he had the slightly breathless quality of someone who had ridden fast from a distance and had not entirely recovered. He looked at the room, registered that it was occupied, and said to Mrs. Crane, in a voice that was entirely audible, "My apologies. I have urgent correspondence for his lordship. I was told Mr. Dawson was expected here this morning." Mrs. Crane was looking past the young man with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has known how a story ends, considerably longer than anyone else in the room, and has been waiting patiently for the relevant page to arrive. The room looked at the doorway. The room looked at the young man with the dispatch case, and then the drawing-room's second door, the one from the corridor that connected to the estate library, opened, and David Dawson stepped in. He had come from the library, where he had evidently been working, because he still held the notebook in his left hand. He had that same composed quality he always had, that steadiness that Eleanor had registered as unusual from the beginning, the precision of a man whose authority resided somewhere deeper than a coat. He looked at the young man in the doorway, and whatever he intended to say did not arrive in time because one of Lady Carlton's daughters, who had been staring at him since he entered, said, in a clear, carrying voice, "The perfectly helpful and entirely catastrophic statement. But that is Lord Ashford. I saw him at the Salisbury Assembly last winter, Mamma. I am quite certain of it." The young man with the dispatch case turned to David. "My lord," he said, with the reflexive correctness of a man who has used the address daily for years, "Lord Pemberton's secretary has written regarding the northern estate boundary. I was told you were—" He looked at the room, understanding arriving visibly. "I beg your pardon. I did not intend to interrupt." The room was very still, very— Lady Carlton's daughter was still looking at David with the earnest certainty of someone who is not often right about things, and knows it when she is. Lady Voss's smile had gone somewhere it could not be immediately retrieved from. Hartley's expression had shifted from recalculated estimate to something harder and considerably less certain of itself. Mrs. Finch was looking from Hartley to David and back again, with the expression of a woman rapidly revising a mental ledger. Eleanor was looking at David. He was looking at her. And for the first time in all their afternoons in the library and their walks along the estate paths and their shared hours in the firelit room, his expression was entirely without reserve. There was nothing measured about it. There was something patient and honest and quietly certain in it. The face of a man who has waited for an appropriate moment and found that it has arrived rather more publicly than he intended. He crossed the room with deliberate steps, past Mrs. Finch's chair and past the striped settee, and he stopped before Eleanor. He was an earl, the Earl of Ashford, and the estate they were standing in was his. And none of that was what was visible on his face. What was visible was simpler and more costly than any of it. "Miss Voss," he said. His voice was quiet and precise, exactly as it always was. "I owe you a more honest introduction than I was able to make at the garden gate. My name is David Alderton." He paused. "I am sorry that the correction arrives in front of so many witnesses." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. In the grate, the fire made its small, steady sound. Through the east window, the October garden lay clear and bare under the afternoon light, the gravel paths wet from the morning's rain, the boxwood hedges spreading beyond their original stations in the familiar way they always had. "I have found," she said in her level voice, "that corrections made in front of witnesses have a somewhat longer useful life." Something warm moved in his expression. He reached into the pocket of his coat and withdrew something small. It was a ring, not the cold gilt sapphire that had been appearing on her writing desk each morning, but something altogether different. A plain gold band with a single pearl set close, unpretentious and carefully made, the sort of thing a man chooses when he is not performing a transaction, but making a commitment. He did not present it with Hartley's manner of a purchase concluded. He held it simply in his open palm and waited. Eleanor looked at it for the space of 3 careful breaths. She thought of the corridor and her mother's voice naming her resistance as theatre. She thought of the library and the fire and the afternoons that had built up between them like layers of a substance more durable than arrangement. She thought of the garden gate in the rain and the way he had followed her to the shed without requiring her to explain why she had offered. She reached out and took the ring. Lady Voss opened her mouth. She closed it. The drawing room was watching, and Lady Voss had spent 30 years managing drawing rooms, but she had never been in a drawing room that had just reconfigured itself as comprehensively as this one. And the social instrument she ordinarily played so precisely had changed all its strings at once, and she could not find the note. Hartley stood. He adjusted his coat. He said, to no one in particular, "I shall not trouble the household further," with the compressed dignity of a man absorbing a considerable surprise and refusing to let it show. He left through the main door, and his well-appointed dark green carriage was heard on the gravel shortly after. Mrs. Crane, from the doorway, watched him go. Then she watched David, who had not moved from in front of Eleanor, who was looking down at the ring now in her hand, and then up at him with an expression that was, for the first time in as long as Eleanor could remember, being in a room with other people, entirely unguarded. No performance, no level containing of what she actually felt. She was simply herself, and what she was precisely and sufficiently enough. The morning call eventually resolved itself, as morning calls do, into the domestic machinery of departures and recovering conversation. Lady Carlton took her daughters and her entirely satisfied curiosity out to their carriage. Mrs. Finch lingered slightly longer than necessary, as people do when they have witnessed something worth the extra minutes. Old Colonel Hadley, who had been sitting in the corner armchair with his tea, and appeared to have followed the events of the room with the satisfied attention of a man who has seen most things, and still finds certain things gratifying, rose and shook David's hand with the plain warmth of an old-fashioned acquaintance and said, "Good man," and said nothing else, because nothing else was required. Lady Voss sat in her chair for some time after the last carriage was heard on the gravel. She looked at the tea table and at the empty cup where Eleanor's had been, and at the space near the east window where Hartley had occupied a chair an hour ago. She looked at her own hands. Then she looked at Eleanor, who was standing near the library door. She did not say anything cutting. She did not have, in this moment, the instrument. What she had instead was something older and considerably less composed than her usual drawing-room expression, a look that was almost bewildered, the look of a woman who has been optimizing for a particular set of outcomes for so long that she has forgotten there were others available. "I only wanted to see you settled," she said. It came out smaller than she had intended. Eleanor looked at her steadily. "I know," she said. "But settled is not the same as sold, Mama." She left it there. She did not elaborate or instruct or perform a verdict. She had said what was true, and it was sufficient. David was waiting in the corridor. Mrs. Crane had retrieved his coat and hat from the library, where he had left them, and was handing them over with the unhurried domestic competence she brought to everything. She did not quite smile at him, but there was something in her face that had the architecture of a smile beneath it, the expression of a woman who has been running a household through a long story and has arrived without surprise at the correct last page. "The North Walk is considerably pleasanter in dry weather," Eleanor said to David when he had his coat on, "if you have had enough of drawing-rooms for one morning." "I find," he said, "that I have had sufficient drawing-rooms for some time." They went out through the library and along the connecting passage to the side door that opened onto the North Walk, the one that ran beside the kitchen garden wall, toward the open parkland, where the October light was thin and clear, and the last of the season's leaves were still on the limes. The gravel was damp underfoot. The boxwood hedges stood at their easy, informal stations. Somewhere behind the wall, the kitchen garden drainage problem remained unresolved, and Eleanor would address it before the week was out. She walked beside him on the familiar path, and she was not performing anything. She was simply there in the garden she knew better than anyone. With the ring on her finger and the October light at its particular clear slant through the lime trees, and the estate around her as it had always been, 400 acres of stone and field and old plantings known to her down to its loose gateposts and its irregular south wall. She had not needed rescuing. That was not what had happened here. She had needed, after a long, quiet patience inside a world that had denominated her worth in what she could settle and what she could be persuaded to accept, to be seen by someone who was not calculating. She had refused what could not be borne, and she had refused it clearly, and she was still standing. The ring caught the light as they walked, a plain gold thing, the pearl small and steady. Behind them, through the library window, Mrs. Crane watched from the corridor with her hands folded before her, and the satisfied expression of a woman who has set good fires in cold rooms for many years, and knows precisely when a room has finally warmed through.